Hello everyone, welcome back to Generic Entertainment. I am your host, Jonathan McJonathan, and I am here today to talk about 2025. Books I read in 2025. I did a decent amount of reading in 2025 actually, more than I had been doing in previous years. And in particular, I got back into reading some of the classics because I feel like after university, I kind of fell off doing that a little bit. The thing that's so great about the quote-unquote classics is that, yes, you have like this canon of books that you're supposed to read if you want to be quote-unquote well-read, and it takes ages to work your way through that. But even if you just read within that canon, which you shouldn't, like you should read outside of it and develop your own interests. But even if you just read inside of it, there's still so much diversity. There's still so many unexpected surprises and enough craziness to occupy an entire lifetime. And it's also nice knowing that a book is well regarded, you know? To not have to do the work yourself of figuring out if a book is good or not, but just to accept that people have decided this book is good and instead try to figure out why it's good. I think there's something just very inherently satisfying about chipping away at that massive block of books that every reader has hovering over their heads, books that you're embarrassed not to have read and that you're always saying, oh, I'll get around to reading it at some point. Of course, as you chip away at the block on one side, it grows on the other side, and so really it's a hopeless endeavor, but you know, chip away we shall anyway. I want to talk first about Dubliners by James Joyce. James Joyce is one of those authors that has been kind of hovering in my awareness for a while now. I feel like over the past few years I have been perpetually encountering references to him in the same way you might perpetually encounter a stranger in different locations and sort of recognize them and be like, oh, hey, do I know you? But you've never actually spoken to them. James Joyce has been like that for me. And finally this year I just decided, you know, I want to know what this guy is all about. So I picked up Dubliners. Let me say, this is now one of my favorite books. This book is a series of shorts, entirely unrelated tales taking place in the city of Dublin, as the name implies, following ordinary people going about their lives. This book was incredibly controversial at the time it was released, and reading it now, that might be surprising to hear because on the face of it, there's nothing in particular that seems viscerally upsetting or shocking or explicit. But I think when you look a little deeper, it is obvious why this book caused such a ruckus and why it took years for James Joyce to be able to publish it. Joyce is describing the baser human emotions in a way that is very raw and almost grim at times. There is so much relentless anguish and despair. And the stories themselves don't really follow the traditional narrative arcs that people would have expected from stories at the time. They're more like anecdotes that sometimes ends abruptly and in unexpected places. It really does feel like a book that sets the stage for modernism and all the developments that you would see in 20th century literature. Still though, reading this book really does feel like time travel in a way. You feel like you're in a completely different place and you're right there in the heads of the characters, feeling all of the things they feel. There's a story in this book, for instance, about a man who suddenly appears to recognize the wasted potential of his life and feels this deep dissatisfaction with the way things have turned out for him. And all of that anger which is building up within him over the course of the story, he eventually takes it out on his child. And there's something so upsetting and tragic about this story, but it's not tragic in a way that feels overly dramatic. It just feels like you're watching this character stumbling around and making all these horrible mistakes and pitying them, really. One of the most famous stories in this collection is actually the only story that I had read before, which is Araby. And this is a story written from the perspective of a young boy. And the stories in this collection follow a general trend where they start out as stories about young people and then eventually become stories about young adults and then about adults. But anyway, this story, Araby, just captivated me the first time I read it because it puts into words a feeling that I haven't really seen explored much in fiction. In the story, the boy is very excited about going to this market to buy something for this girl he likes, and he thinks all day about how excited he is to go to this market and how amazing the experience is going to be. And then he finally gets there after a series of long delays that kind of sour the whole experience for him. And the place is almost closing up, and it's just a big disappointment. Like, he had built this up in his mind so much without even realizing that he was building it up that he just becomes embittered and frustrated and angry. And that's pretty much all that happens in the story. Like, on the face of it, there's nothing really particularly upsetting about that. But because of the way that Joyce writes, you're following the emotions of the characters such that even you are not aware of the way that you're being manipulated until you finally get to this twist at the end where the market turns out to be so disappointing and you feel the same anguish that this boy feels. Probably the most famous story in this collection, though, is the final story, The Dead, which is just astoundingly good. It follows a very similar structure in a way and deals with a similar theme of the deep tragedy of subtle disappointment. And I don't want to spoil what happens in the story because you really do just need to read it for yourself in order to experience it. But the final 5 pages or so of The Dead are some of my favorite writing in any book ever. I think these stories are so important because they put to words experiences that all of us have, but that we rarely think about, and sometimes we don't even acknowledge. And now just constantly in my day-to-day life, I find myself thinking about the characters in these books and feeling solidarity with them when something happens to me that is kind of similar to something that happened to them. This book is brilliant. I highly recommend it to everyone. So after reading Dubliners, I immediately went and picked up Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, also by James Joyce. By the way, I should say, even though James Joyce has a reputation for being an incredibly difficult author, that mostly comes from Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. These first 2 novels are not too difficult. This one is a little bit more difficult to read than Dubliners because it is following the budding career of a young artist who is very well educated. So especially in the second half of the novel, there are a lot of very in-depth philosophical conversations that make references to Aquinas and Aristotle and all these thinkers. But even so, I think this is a novel that pretty much anybody can jump into without too much preparation. Ulysses, on the other hand, probably not. I do want to get around to reading that at some point, but it's going to be a bit of an odyssey, if you get my joke. I'm sorry, that was... I really enjoyed this book. It follows this character, Stephen Dedalus, who in many ways is a self-insert character modeled off of Joyce's own life. For example, he spends the early chapters going to a Jesuit school, which is, in fact, the same school that James Joyce went to when he was that age. So the parallels are pretty obvious between their 2 lives. Stephen is also one of the main characters in Ulysses, incidentally, so this is kind of like a prequel. But the thing that makes this novel so interesting is the way that it's grounded in real human experience and the way it doesn't really follow a typical narrative structure. It feels more like a series of memories. You're jumping around between all these different moments in Stephen's life, starting from the time when he's very, very young, barely even able to form coherent memories, and moving all the way up until the time when he's in his early 20s. And the writing style reflects Stephen's development. So in the early chapters, when it's written from the perspective of a child, there are all these babyish words and the sentences are very short and simple, and there's just an air of confusion in the air. James Joyce, I have to say, is really good at writing children. I think a lot of authors, when they become adults, forget what it's like to be a child, but something that Joyce captures really well is the sense of just utter bafflement that children feel all the time. There's this big, confusing adult world with all these rules that you have to follow, and nobody really ever explains anything to you. And you just sort of have to infer what's going on based on context clues. For example, there's a scene early on in this book where Stephen's parents get into an argument with one of their friends about a political question, and Stephen the whole time is just sort of sitting there struggling to understand what they're talking about. But even if he doesn't have the awareness to fully understand what they're saying, he can still feel the emotional intensity of this argument, and it weighs on him. As the novel goes on, Stephen becomes aware of these different aspects of himself and of the world. He starts to become aware of his sexuality at a certain point. Another reason why this book, in addition to Dubliners, was very controversial at the time it was written. But then at a certain point, about halfway through the novel, there's a lengthy chapter which mostly consists of a sermon. And in this sermon, the pastor that Stephen is listening to is going on and on about hell and describing in an absurd amount of visceral detail the physical and psychological torments of what he imagines hell to be like. And this goes on for so long that you really can't help but be in Stephen's head and feel this sense of panic building within you. And Stephen, of course, feels incredibly guilty this whole time because of his budding sexuality, which he ends up rejecting entirely and then adopting a very devoted religious lifestyle at a very young age. I think there are many themes that you could draw out of this novel, and I know for sure I missed many of them. But one of the things that really stuck with me is Stephen's struggle to find the proper balance between the mind and the body and how that shapes his artistic development. He ends up developing an entire theory of art which seems to be based directly on these experiences of first abandoning himself to his own carnal desires and then doing a complete 180 and adopting a very religious lifestyle. He says, "The feelings excited by improper arts are kinetic, desire or loathing. Desire urges us to possess, to go to something. Loathing urges us to abandon, to go from something. The arts which excite them, pornographical or didactic, are therefore improper arts. The aesthetic emotion, I use the general term, is therefore static. The mind is arrested and raised above desire and loathing." And obviously, because Stephen is to a certain extent a self-insert character, I think we can read into this a little of Joyce's own theory of aesthetics. Joyce is really trying to capture the full spectrum of human experience in his books, from its ugliest to its most beautiful aspects, and I think this philosophy reflects that. Anyway, moving on, I want to talk next about A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. Another early 20th century novel. This is a book about colonialism, in short, but it's also about a lot of other things. What makes this book so interesting is the way that it explores how these unspoken hierarchies that exist within our lives shape our relationships and the ways in which we're able to communicate with others, even when we try to deny that fact. E.M. Forster was a British author, so he obviously brings that perspective to the table when he's writing about English colonialism. But the different characters in this book explore the perspectives of both the colonizers and the colonized. The main story concerns these two English women who are visiting India, Adela Custede and Mrs. Moore, and their relationship with a man named Dr. Aziz. The two women are very interested in India and seem to genuinely want to learn more about the local culture, but because of their privileged position in society, it's incredibly difficult for them to actually get that authentic perspective, and one questions the degree to which their interest in India is mostly a vague Orientalist romanticization of the country. Regardless, when Mrs. Moore meets Aziz, the two of them really hit it off and they start to become close friends, but this friendship is strained by all the subtle misunderstandings that necessarily arise when you have this kind of relationship in this kind of environment. What eventually ends up happening, and the conflict that consumes most of the novel, is that Dr. Aziz is falsely accused of assaulting Adela Custede. Adela clearly has some sort of traumatic experience at this point in the novel, and then it seems like some of her friends suggest to her while she's in her frazzled state that Dr. Aziz might have made inappropriate advances on her, which she agrees to. And of course, within the colonial context of this novel, this is a huge scandal because it reinforces the agenda that the British are propagating, that the Indians are uncivilized. But meanwhile, Dr. Aziz himself is not necessarily a perfect character because even in the midst of this crisis, he confides in one of his friends that the real reason he's upset about this is not the false accusation of assault, but the fact that it was Adela who made it. And he considers Adela to be quite unattractive. So laid on top of the colonizer-colonized dichotomy that is being explored here, there's also the man-woman dichotomy, and the relationship between these different power structures is really subtly explored. It's a very frustrating book to read at times. There are no easy answers here, and it all feels kind of gross and unsatisfying. It's not a feel-good read. Next, I want to talk about The Awakening by Kate Chopin, a novel that was also very controversial when it was released. This book was published in 1899 and is a story about a married woman's exploration of her own identity and her own desires. It's very obvious from early on that she's unhappy in her marriage, and so she's drawn again and again into almost infidelity. But I think the reason this novel was so controversial when it was published is because there is very little condemnation on the author's part of her actions. If anything, there's a lot of sympathy for her. On the one hand, the main character, Edna Pontellier's journey in this novel is one of neglecting all her obligations towards her husband and her children, abandoning all these responsibilities in favor of chasing after one pleasure after another without really having a clear idea of what she wants and where she's trying to go. But on the other hand, if one abandons that moralistic perspective and looks at the novel the way the novel actually presents itself, it's a story about frustration. I think Edna is a deeply sympathetic character because she never really has any bad intentions. She's just frustrated. She wants more out of life than what life can offer her at this time, and she sees her future in this marriage as one of drudgery and disappointment, and ultimately, without really making a conscious decision to, she decides to abandon that future. This leads her to face challenges that she wouldn't have faced if she hadn't done this, but at the same time, you can't really blame her. It's not like she hates her family. She certainly doesn't hate her children or her husband, but there is still, in a very real sense, a burden to her. Next, I read Mrs. Dalloway, another book from an author who I have never explored before and who I have really needed to get to for a long time. If you're not familiar with Virginia Woolf, this book is overwhelming. There's so much to say about it. I don't even know where to start. It's a very short book. It's only like 200 pages or so, but it is just a non-stop deluge of sensations and words. It feels like being trapped in the mind of somebody whose brain is just going and going and going. The sentences are so long. There are no chapters in the book. It's just one big blob of text for the most part. And as if that isn't confusing enough, the novel is not solely focused on Mrs. Dalloway at all. It jumps very freely between all of its many characters. The style is difficult to get into at first. You have to be in the right mood for it, and if you're not in the right mood for it, it can give you a headache. Once you do get into it though, assuming you can manage to do that, it's hard to put down. It's a maximalist novel in a lot of respects, but instead of being maximalist in the sense of an author like Joyce, where he's trying to draw all these references to all these famous other works of literature and sort of compile them together, Woolf is more interested in the variety of human experiences and having sympathy for all the different types of people who exist and trying to understand where their different perspectives came from. There is not a single character in this book who I think you can't feel some sympathy for. Even the characters who absolutely hate each other's guts. Two of the most important characters in the novel, though, are Mrs. Dalloway herself, of course, and also a man named Septimus Warren Smith, who doesn't really know Clarissa Dalloway at all and whose story barely intercepts with hers, but who is nonetheless her counterpart in a lot of important respects. Mrs. Dalloway is this free-spirited, energetic person who really believes in human bonds. The novel takes place over the course of a single day as she's preparing for a party, and the novel makes clear that the reason why she throws these parties is because she wants to bring people together, and she really believes in the richness of human life and the joys that can be found in unexpected connections. Septimus Warren Smith, meanwhile, has a hard time finding any joy in life. He is a veteran from the First World War who is clearly suffering from what we would now call PTSD and depression. He's constantly visiting these psychiatrists who are giving their own opinions on what they think is wrong with him, but at the end of the day, he's just disillusioned with life. He's been through so much hardship that the good things in life seem like these tiny flickers in comparison to all the misfortune in the world. And the kind of joie de vivre that Clarissa embodies is just totally alien to him. But what's so great about Woolf is that she makes you understand both of these perspectives. She makes you see how they're both valid. Every person is shaped by their own individual circumstances, by their relationships, by the way they were raised, by their lot in life. Some of us are born wealthy, some of us are born poor, some of us are young, some of us are old. And all of these things combine to create our different personalities that sometimes bounce off each other. But in the end, we can't really help who we are. Virginia Woolf is kind of like this god jumping like an acrobat from one person to another and showing you just how myopic your own understanding of the world probably is. Finally, I want to talk about a novel that was actually recommended to me by one of you in the comments of one of my previous videos, which is If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino. I wanted to get into this one for a while because I had encountered Calvino before in some of my college classes, and I'm so glad I finally got around to it because this is such a joy of a book to read. In contrast to a lot of the emotionally heavy books I've been talking about today, this one is so whimsical and fun. When I first started reading it, it reminded me of nothing so much as the works of Lemony Snicket, which I was obsessed with as a kid. And that's because it's not written at all like a normal novel. It's written in the second person, and the main character in the novel is you. All of the novel's events are described as if it's you who is partaking in them, and Italo Calvino is this narrator who is kind of interjecting himself into your life and telling you how you should feel about stuff. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, this is the opening paragraph of the novel. You are about to begin reading Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Relax, concentrate, dispel every other thought, let the world around you fade. Best to close the door, the TV is always on in the next room. Tell the others right away, no, I don't want to watch TV. Raise your voice, they won't hear you otherwise. I'm reading, I don't want to be disturbed. Maybe they haven't heard you with all that racket. Speak louder, yell, I'm beginning to read Italo Calvino's new novel. As soon as I read this first paragraph, the style was just so arresting that I knew I was hooked. But as the novel develops, it goes in a very unexpected direction. What it ends up being about is about you, the reader, trying desperately to read a book and consistently failing at doing so. At first, you're reading a book called If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, which exists in the world of this book, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, but the book suddenly ends very early on, and as you go to try to find a new copy, you find that this book is a completely different book. So you start reading that book, but then that book ends, and so you try to find out where the rest of that book is, but you end up with a completely new book, and this happens 10 times. The structure of the novel is basically the story of you trying desperately to read this book and slowly uncovering this massive conspiracy interspersed with all these unfinished passages from the novels that you're trying to read. In a sense, it reminded me a little bit of Cloud Atlas in the way that it jumps between all these different stories, but the difference between this book and Cloud Atlas is that there are no conclusions to any of these stories, and also even though all these novels you're trying to read are different from one another, there are also very clear similarities. They all concern a male protagonist who is almost tortuously introspective, who ends up encountering a woman who he very quickly falls in love with. And the structure of these little vignettes parallels the meta story of the novel itself, because in the novel, you, the reader, come into contact with a woman who is another reader, who is also confusingly sometimes referred to as you, who you end up developing a relationship with and falling in love with over the course of the novel. This is a very, very deeply postmodern book in every sense of the word. It's a book about books, and it's also a book about writing. And I think if you are both a big reader and a big writer, you'll probably get the most out of reading it. Because rather than telling a conventional narrative, what Calvino is trying to explore is what the experience of reading a book is like. In some cases, when the passages from the novels you're trying to read are included in the book itself, Calvino doesn't present you with the actual passages, but instead describes the experience of reading those passages. For example, the first of these passages starts like this. The novel begins in a railway station. A locomotive huffs. Steam from a piston covers the opening of the chapter. A cloud of smoke hides part of the first paragraph. Rather than presenting you with an actual novel, Calvino is poetically describing the experience of what it would be like to read that novel if that novel existed. It's very weird and very meta, but it's brilliant. As the story unfolds, it starts to become more clear why the novel was written this way. One of the things that Calvino is trying to explore is this question of why stories are so fascinating to us. And by presenting the beginnings of all these different novels, he's able to get us to reflect on what makes us drawn into novels in the first place. I mentioned earlier that this novel revolves around a vast conspiracy. As it would turn out, you, the protagonist's inability to finish reading the novel that he started trying to read is the product of a vast international artistic conspiracy to make it impossible to finish reading novels entirely. The actual details of this conspiracy are ridiculously complicated, and I couldn't even begin to summarize it in a video like this. But at the end of the day, the details aren't really that important because the themes are clear. Calvino is trying to demonstrate how there is something so magical about the act of beginning a novel, and also he's trying to question if that magic inevitably fades over time the longer the novel goes on. The character behind this conspiracy to make all novels incomplete seems to be obsessed with this idea that an unfinished story is somehow more pure than a finished story. There's so much more I could say about this book. I could go on for ages. It's a really complex book, but that's all I can say for now, so if I piqued your interest, hopefully you'll give it a shot. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Sorry I'm late on this video. Let me know if you've read any of these, or what you've been reading, or what I should read next. I would love to hear it. I don't post these book review videos all that often, so if you're coming here from my skits and you're confused as to why I'm posting this, hello! This is also what I do sometimes. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please subscribe, and have a wonderful day, everyone.